Oi, boa noite a todo mundo. Olá, você está em mais um evento do mestrado e doutorado em comunicação da UNISINOS, hoje com uma parceria inédita entre os grupos DigiLabour e Cultpop, com a professora Brooke, Erin e Duffy, que vai conversar com a gente daqui a pouco. Boa noite, professora Adriana Amaral. Sejam bem-vindos.
Olá, boa noite, tudo bom? Eu espero que todos aproveitem essa nossa conferência de hoje, nesse featuring do DigiLabour e o Cultpop, né, trazendo essa discussão que é tão importante, tão cara para a gente, sobre a questão dos produtores de conteúdo e influencers, com a professora Brooke.
Muito obrigado, Adriana. Agora nós vamos apresentar a professora Brooke Erin Duffy, que é professora na Cornell University, autora de livros como Not Getting Paid to Do What You Love, Gender, Social Media and Aspirational Work, e vai lançar ano que vem o livro sobre plataformas e produção cultural, junto com o Thomas Powell e o David Nieborg. Suas áreas de pesquisa são gênero, identidade e desigualdades, precariedade do trabalho criativo, plataformização das indústrias culturais e midiáticas, algoritmos e quantificação e cultura do consumo em perspectiva crítica. Algumas das suas pesquisas atuais envolvem as experiências de precariedade de criadores de conteúdo em plataformas como TikTok e Instagram, e também tem pesquisado o trabalho invisível nas mídias sociais, envolvendo também Big Data, algoritmos e desigualdades. Welcome to DigiLabour and Cultpop, Professor Brooke Erin Duffy. It's a great pleasure to having us tonight.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Central New York. It is lovely to be here. And let me just begin by extending my thanks to Professors Grolman and Amaral for inviting me. And I'm very much looking forward to having the chance to respond to your questions in a little bit. But what I'm going to be doing today is presenting my work in progress on the promise and precarity of visibility in social media labor. So let me get this set up. Okay, so as I mentioned, this project, or as I'm about to mention, this project is on the promise and precarity of visibility in social media labor. And this is research that I am presenting with my collaborators, Annika Pinch, Rudy Sanen, and Megan Sawe. And I want to begin by taking us back a few months to the beginning of the pandemic that is shaping so much of our lives, and bring up a few articles that really resonated with me in the context of my ongoing work into social media content creation and influencers. And some of you may have seen articles like this, but essentially, a number of high-profile publications began to prognosticate the fate of social media content creators against the backdrop of the wider social and economic upheaval wrought by the pandemic. So perhaps hyperbolically, Vanity Fair headlined, "Is this the end of influencing as we knew it?" And Wired, meanwhile, published this series of articles that were sort of forecasting the unknown fates of paid Instagrammers. And according to the article's author, brand deals have dried up, sponsored posts have been delayed, and the author noted the business of influence is going to change. Other analysts had kind of focused on the similarly fragile career prospects of those pursuing careers in what Cunningham and Craig describe as social media entertainment, and in particular YouTube and TikTok. And in the US, at least, TikTok has faced an especially capricious future amid rumored ban and its wider sales. And so I came across this article in the MIT Technology Review that was focused on TikTok stars. Abby Olheimer summarized, "Whether the app goes or stays, this moment is forcing creators toward a realization that making or even consuming things on the internet means depending that platforms could change drastically in an instant." And so together, these reports underscore this fundamental reality of careers that are born by social media. Namely, they are profoundly unstable, bound up as they are to the wider flux, which is endemic to the social, economic, political, and technological realms. So it bears worth noting that this idea of instability or precarity is really been central to how theorists have been understanding and conceptualizing the creative economy for decades. Careers in the creative industries, as many of you know, have long been marked by this sort of intermittent work, long hours in exchange for little or no pay, and the mentality that you're only as good as your last book or movie or film, or in this case, social media product. But the social media economy, with its neoliberal tenets of self-branding individualism and its oversaturated supply of talented hopefuls, amplifies many of the less auspicious features. This is an argument that Zoe Glatt makes convincingly in a journal article coming in, I believe, International Journal of Communication. But so in recent years, scholars have drawn upon in-depth interviews and participant observation in hopes of, or in an attempt to at least, highlight the uncertainty and the instability that structure platforms such as Instagram, YouTube, Pinterest, Vine. And one key theme that cuts across this research and sort of the wider realm of digital labor research is the fraught nature of metrics and algorithmic systems. And so this is where our research that I'm going to be presenting today sort of takes off. My collaborators and I found this work to be very rich and productive, but what we wanted to do was think about how we can establish an understanding of creator experience that cuts across these platforms, because the reality is increasingly social media content creators, whether they are Instagrammers or TikTok creators or Pinterest tastemakers, they are compelled to develop a brand that spans across platforms. And so in this sense, we really wanted to interview people about the more ecological nature of platform creation. We also wanted to conduct research that sort of spanned evolutions and temporalities, owing to the fact that much of the research on social media evolution and social media uncertainty locates this instability within particular temporal contexts. And so the data that my collaborators and I collected actually took place over 3 waves of data collection, where the first really focused on interviews with Instagrammers. The second phase focused on interviews with Instagrammers as well as YouTube creators, Pinterest tastemakers, and Twitter personalities. And then finally, and most recently, the last phase of interviews was just conducted this past fall with individuals who were creating content on TikTok. And so it's perhaps not surprisingly that the interview activities were guided by what my collaborator, Emily Hund, and I have called the visibility mandate. Essentially, this idea to put yourself out there, to be visible, to get seen. And I just want to be clear that this is not an expression of individualist narcissism, but rather a requirement for career success, as many other researchers have pointed out. Essentially, in platformized creative economy, metrics are the central axes on which power and resources are exchanged. And so this is in the form of brand sponsorships, various deals, collaborations, and so forth. But crucially, this sort of motivation to be visible went beyond just drawing audiences or advertisers. Rather, it was often bound up with this ideal to curry favor with platform companies. And so Instagrammer Alicia, for instance, explained that if she hits this 10,000 follower threshold, she'll be able to take advantage of various practices on the site. She said, once you hit that 10K number, whether your followers are organic or not, and here she was nodding towards the tendency for creators to buy followers, she said you can take fully advantage of having a business account. And I heard something similar from TikTok creators who, once they hit this particular threshold or this potential minimum benchmark, then they could participate in various platform activities, be it the creator marketplace was one that came up. And of course, these metric benchmarks that are created on and through the platform have the discernible business logic. Namely, they amp up the data requirements, which of course benefits TikTok, Instagram, and others of their ilk. At the same time that there was this push to grow one's metrics, there was also this sort of pervasive fear of invisibility or not being seen. And this is something which Tina Bucher and Sophie Bishop have drawn attention to as well. So one of the TikTok creators we interviewed said that one of the reasons she was so interested in creating site on TikTok was because on Instagram, her numbers weren't increasing. She said, I feel like there's so many people on Instagram, but I'm not being seen. To Ashley, this sort of invisibility or this feeling of invisibility in a quantified sense led to some feelings of insecurity on her own self-worth. So Ashley said, you know, if someone in her pod, meaning her community of fellow creators, has been getting more followers than her and you don't know why, she says, you know, sometimes it can mess with you. She said, you know, you wonder, why wasn't I good enough? And so it seems important here to highlight the fact that platformized content creation is structured both by the promise, but also the precarity of visibility. And so what I want to do in the next 15 minutes or so is explore how this realm of platformized content creation is structured by precarity, but precarity that cuts across 3 different levels. And so we can almost think of this as a sort of set of nested precarities. And so these 3 levels that I'll be talking about, the first is the wider market context. The second is the platform ecology. And so here I mean the social media ecosystem at any given time. And finally, the whims and vagaries of particular platforms, especially those which are hitched to their algorithmic systems. So we'll start with market precarity. So my collaborators and I were somewhat struck by how much flux was actually rooted in the volatility of wider cultural markets, or at least assumptions of their volatility. And this is not necessarily new. A lot of the comments we heard actually echoed things that scholars of the TV industry have been arguing since the 80s, namely that there's this really important sense, if you're working in the creative industries, to know the audience. And so Jason described these sort of precarious markets by saying, you know, when content goes out there, I think it's about what people are watching, what they want to see, what they identify with. As a creator, he said, that's the hard part of always coming up with what are people going to engage with, what's going to resonate with them. Cooper similarly offered a euphemism for visibility that many of our participants use, namely this idea of doing well. And doing well means garnering metrics. And so when I asked him what he thinks does well, he said, it's hard to predict. You don't know. Once I post a video, it's out of my hands. I have no control. And so I'll do everything I can when I'm creating a video to make sure it's as entertaining as possible. But beyond that, I have no control. So again, this sort of pervasive sense of uncertainty on, you know, when I let something out into the world, is it going to draw attention or is it going to get 0 hits? With a further nod towards this idea of thinking about the metrics of traditional industries, Natalie said she goes very carefully and thinks about how to measure audiences. She said, I try to ask my audience for feedback as much as I can by talking on my stories or putting a poll on my stories or saying, would you rather see this or that? And so while there is a much longer history of this sort of market precarity, what is unprecedented is the level of precarity that was situated in the wider industry ecology. And so, as I mentioned earlier, scholars like Cunningham and Craig and Zoe Glatt have noted how creators tend to develop a cross-platform branded persona in the event that the platform on which they've created content suddenly disappears. And so a number of the creators we interviewed had this feeling that they've spent all their time and energy cultivating a brand presence on whatever site, but it could disappear without notice. So Lynn, who was an Instagram content creator, told us this kind of mantra of don't put all your eggs in one basket. She said bloggers will put their time and attention into Instagram, but people have said don't do that because Instagram or social media in general is always changing. She said, I feel like Facebook 10 years ago was the thing, then Instagram, now Instagram's the thing. She said, but what's next? Is it going to be Instagram? We don't know. There's Snapchat, Twitter, YouTube. And so, very tellingly, she said, if you put all your time and focus in one platform, you're in some trouble, I guess. Naina had a very similar comment. She said she'd been spending all her time on Instagram, but decided in order to sort of mitigate the risk, she encouraged people to devote some of their time and energy to Pinterest. She said, because, when Instagram fails, you need to have a backup plan. She said, because when Instagram fails, you're done. If you don't have a backup plan, you're done. You're going to be working at McDonald's and all you're going to be able to say is, oh, and I had, 50,000 followers on Instagram. So this idea that the metric currency you have is not necessarily going to convert in a cross-platform environment. A lot of the comments about the precarious industry ecology sprung up around TikTok. Again, as I said, in the US case, until about 2 weeks ago, there was a lot of concerns about a rumored political ban. And so the creators we were interviewing were really worried that they were going to wake up and they were going to be completely shut out of their TikTok accounts. And so very evocatively, Anthony said, I believe TikTok is not very future-proof at its current state. He said, in many creators, if they can't really make a living, they might just move on to other platforms. Caleb said something similarly, and again, brought this into the context of the rumored political ban, noting you've probably seen on the news about the potential ban, everything happening with the app, with China. So it's kind of given me a wake-up call to try to not focus so heavily on one platform, even though I'm doing so well, and to try to have an audience on multiple platforms just in case my account gets banned or something happens like that. And so again, in all these cases, we can see this sort of fear, which is hitched to the idea that at any moment, the platform on which you have built your livelihood, where you have an audience, where you have cultivated advertisers, could disappear, and you're not going to be able to convert this success into the wider platform ecosystem. So finally, and perhaps not surprisingly, especially to those of you who have been studying various realms of digital labor, a lot of the platform was tied to particular algorithmic changes and wider platform changes. And so this idea of understanding and anticipating off-changing algorithms was so crucial that the volatility, or at least reckoning with the volatility with algorithmic systems, was seen as a sort of necessary part of the job. And before I give some examples of algorithmic precarity, it is important to kind of situate that there was a sort of wider uncertainty that a platform could introduce a feature at any moment that could sort of wreak havoc on creators' livelihoods. My colleague Arturo Arriagada has written about how the introduction of stories on Instagram kind of caused the creator network to reconfigure their practices. And so this is really amplified in the case of algorithms because, unlike the case of stories, you can't see what is underpinning them. You can't see their logic. And so this sort of idea of algorithmic precarity cut across our interviews. Liz, for instance, described the sort of uncertainty where the algorithm is always changing. She said, so people are always trying to find new ways to beat it. She said, people want to get more followers, they want to get noticed, but they want to beat this platform that nobody really knows. And again, this sort of idea of we can devote our energy in hopes of learning the algorithm, but because it is concealed to us behind the sort of, the metaphor of the black box, that we don't know that our time and energy will pay off. Eva said something similar that highlights the importance of temporalities of algorithms. She said, Instagram doesn't really share what goes into making them. They tweak it whenever they want, and sometimes they announce it, sometimes they don't. People just sort of noticing that things start happening. And by noticing, often this meant people were noticing that they weren't getting the same numbers they used to get, and they attributed this to an algorithmic change. So Cooper, who wasn't on Instagram but was on TikTok, said something remarkably similar. Cooper said that, something that's worth noting about TikTok is the unpredictability of the algorithm. It's not always super consistent, and you'll go a week or two where your views are only half of what they were in other weeks. And even if the production of your content, the quality isn't changing, you have no way of really knowing how things work. Lana, Instagram content creator, again, had a really similar comment about nobody really knows for sure how this algorithm works. And here she talked about the importance of the wider community and sort of sharing what we may think of as sort of folk theories about how they work. And here she talked about, sometimes I share with the community that the algorithm will punish you, and sometimes it'll reward you. And so it's just kind of word or mouth. Nothing is confirmed or denied. Skipping ahead here, she said, but we take these very super careful extreme measures to not get punished by the algorithm. And so what I want to do here in the last few minutes is talk about this idea of this sort of insidious threat of being demoted or shadow banned, where someone's content is rendered invisible without them receiving notification. Shadow banning is a term that cuts across platforms, and according to Cortez, it just refers to the removal or suppression of content without the platform notifying you, the user, that your content is in violation of guidelines. And so people would have these accounts where, I'd have so many followers and all of a sudden I'd wake up and I'd get 10 and I wasn't sure what was happening. So I think I was shadow banned. And what was interesting is that creators across the social media ecology all had these accounts or knew people who had supposedly been shadow banned. Bethany said that Pinterest is known for blocking accounts very frequently. Someone can block you for legit nothing, just like really nothing. It's a very unpredictable platform. Ruby, who had a presence across a number of social media platforms, said that, I've been shadow banned probably 5 times in the past year. She said it's so strange because, this account will have 10,000 followers and each video gets 10,000 views. And then all of a sudden I'll be shadow banned, and I'll know this because you'll get 4 or 5 views and you're like, what's going on here? But despite the various accounts that circulated of shadow banning, there was a number of people who claimed that shadow banning didn't actually exist. It was really just a marker that you had produced bad content. And so, what this narrative essentially did is project the critique back on creators rather than on the platform. So Clyde was saying that, TikTok is a very random platform, something I heard over and over. He said one video you'll get like 5 million views and another you'll get 200. And so he said it's easy to say you've been shadow banned or that TikTok doesn't like you if all of your videos do that well. The inconsistency is hard to deal with. And you don't want to attribute it to your own content. So you kind of want to assume TikTok took action on your account when that's most likely not the case. And so here's where the tension plays out between, am I getting punished by the platform on which I create content? Or again, is it just that my content doesn't do well because it's not very good, it's not very engaging? But I do think it's important to take stock of how these whether shadow banning is real or not, how creators understood this and framed it, especially in the context of inequality. So Nishida told me, she was sort of unpacking this narrative of shadow banning and said, you know, I've seen a lot of these people of color creators before, and that made me think, well, maybe shadow banning is a real thing, because, you know, it's interesting that people are saying a lot of these creators of color, they've never been seen, but they've been creating content the whole time. And she said this in a response to when TikTok suddenly, in the wake of a lot of racial strife in the US, in particular, the murder of George Floyd, TikTok went out and gave visibility to a lot of creators of color. And so the debate here was whether before that they had actually been banning them. And final place where this sort of speculation about shadow banning played out was among participants in the Creator Fund. And as I mentioned earlier, you need to reach a certain benchmark in order to get access to the Creator Fund. On TikTok, I believe it's 10,000 followers. What was super interesting is that a number of creators said that as soon as you got access to the TikTok Creator Fund, then TikTok would shadow ban you, so they wouldn't have to compensate you as much. E was one of these creators and said that, you know, your followers are going down a little bit once you get access to the Creator Fund. And, you know, talked about the sort of correlation between joining and your metric success. And, you know, he said, in the end, I think I'll end up leaving it just because I feel like it's pretty accurate saying that, you know, TikTok is sort of strategically punishing people once they allow them to access this financial source. So I want to wrap up here and see what questions you all have. But essentially, in response to the profound flux that seems to structure content creation, I think it's important to sort of think holistically about what we might think of as an ecological framework to understanding precarities. And so the layers of insecurity I just described might be thought of as Russian nesting dolls, if you're familiar, where each one is positioned inside the other. And by here, I want to capture the fact that precarity is by no means discrete. Much like these wooden nesting dolls, the precarity of algorithmic systems are located within unstable platforms, which are located in a widely volatile social media ecology, which are located in the wider market precarity that has long structured the creative economy. And not all of these levels, as I mentioned before, are without precedent. There's this tendency to want to fetishize the new. But it's important to note that cultural producers have long sort of faced the insecurity of cultural markets in particular, not knowing what's going to do well and what they can do to sort of predict what's going to garner the highest audience ratings and metrics. And here I refer to Todd Gitlin's 1983 description of networks that, quote, fetishize the immediate numerical gratification. And so while this fetishization of metric benchmarks is not necessarily new, what is new is the way in which these platform precarities have sort of amped up certain kinds of insecurity. Given my own longstanding interest in labor, I can't help but note the profound laboring requirements that are extended to content creators as they are expected to devote their time, energy, and even resources in learning what researchers have called algorithmic literacies, or trying to figure out how to game the algorithm or how to do well. And so what this does is it introduces a lot of power asymmetries into the platformized creative marketplace, you know, in particular as part of larger systems where the platform lacks transparency. There are various forms of algorithmic bias, especially those linked to race and gender and sexuality. And at the same time, thinking about these power asymmetries, it's important to consider how this platform creator ecology renders creators of all stripes sort of beholden to their whims. And so this is really amplified by the Silicon Valley siren call to move fast and break things. And so I want to close with this quote from one of our interviewees, Eva, who said, "The changing platform is just something you have to agree to when you start using these things. and accept things are always going to change. Social media changes all the time. So you either just get really angry at Instagram and Facebook changing and stay with the platform, or you leave. And so in closing, I think we should consider the promise of visibility, but also wonder, question, probe, interrogate whether there might be an alternative to this precarity. And thank you for your attention, and thanks to my collaborators.
Okay, thank you very much, Brooke. It's a great presentation.
Thank you.
1 second. Okay. Here are some questions from many people, like Beatriz Polivanov. I would like to know more about the influencers and creators who were interviewed. Would they be considered web celebrities? Which areas or expertise are they from? Fitness, fashion, sport, or even academic work, research? What are their profiles? I believe that there are differences between their perceptions regarding their expertise and number of followers.
Yeah, thank you. I love this question. And as a backstory, my previous research focused very narrowly on the realms of fashion and beauty influencers. And so with this project, one of the things we sought to do is rely upon various networks to connect us with creators across genres. And so we had everyone from fashion and beauty to gaming, to sports, to comedy. And, you know, we've been trying with this data, as I said, it's a work in progress, to sort of suss out the differences. But what's more striking is how similar the sort of uncertainty they feel with the algorithms. But I do, you know, in thinking about where some of these wider tensions, the one I think that is super interesting is within genres, those who consider themselves the sort of more relatable or authentic fashion influencers or sports enthusiasts, and those who position themselves as experts or consultants. And so we actually spoke with a number of people who have garnered such a following that they not only project themselves as experts to advertisers and audiences, but also to other influencers. And so they kind of project their image as consultants and sell their services, including tips and tools to work the algorithm to other influencers. So that's one of the places we see the hierarchies. But yeah, I mean, I think, again, we sampled very broadly and were struck by how little differences there were in sort of this grappling with the wider precarity. Yeah, but it's a great question. And again, it's something as we comb through the data more that we're trying to figure out if there were particular genres and sectors where the precarity was even more pronounced, especially given how saturated certain subgenres of content are.
Great. The next question is from Anna George. Do you have insights on interviews perception around algorithmic inequality regarding gender or ethnicity or race?
Yeah, a few, I guess I would say maybe 2 or 3. So a small number of our participants called attention to this. And I think a lot of it was motivated by less their own experiences and more the conversations they were part of the community. And I think it's really important to note, you know, when we think of creators as participants in this highly individualized, highly competitive spheres, that a lot of ways they work together. You know, they establish small communities of knowledge, and there were concerns in particular about creators of color that they had been, I don't know if shadow banned, but they had definitely been punished And then TikTok was only giving them visibility as a way to respond to, larger concerns about racism in the US and the US technological environment. And so that's one place it played out. In terms of sexuality too, there was a bit of concern that, and I think this was on TikTok as well, that TikTok was not allowing the same levels of visibility for sort of non-heteronormative expressions. I don't know if we found anything in particular about gender, but I know that Sophie Bishop, if you're not familiar with her work, has done some really compelling research on the gender differences in that. But in all of these cases, again, whether or not there is bias, what happens is these concerns spread and circulate through the communities, and they shape how creators work and how they understand their relationship with the platform. So it's really important to kind of take these seriously, and in particular, think about who gets rewarded and who doesn't. I mean, certainly the Instagram community, especially in, like I said, the fields that I have been studying for the longest, fashion, beauty, and so on, has certainly long been a place that has seen that advertisers reward young, white, thin, heteronormative, privileged influencers. And that's what a lot of the critique in the wake of the pandemic sort of rallied against. Yeah, thank you.
Larissa Pontes also asked, and I'm gonna join my question along with it. It's about, she said that she's curious about the fields, but you already told us that they're beauty, fashion, etc. But if there is someone connected to research or intellectual or teaching or political. And in that sense, my question is that many of the influencers and creators here in Brazil during the pandemic, even though they are not connected to politics or people of color or any of the questions on gender, etc., but they had to start to talk about this during the pandemic. So I don't know if you noticed something like that also in your sample.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really fascinating to see the evolution of, I don't like the term influencers, but we'll use it for a shorthand, but the evolution of how influencers are understood in the wider popular imagination over the past few years. I mean, in the early days, they were widely dismissed as sort of vain and frivolous and unimportant and not taken seriously. And then, we saw a transition to when people started to see the profound sums that some of them were making, certainly not all. Then, we started to see 2018 was the year of the influencer, 2019 was the year of the influencer. But as you know, just within, the past 8 or 9 months, influencers who are upheld as these sort of ordinary people are called upon to project their political affiliations, to speak out on issues of systematic racism, to talk about wider systems of inequality. And it reminds me of a project that I did maybe 2 years ago with Emily Hund, where, of course, this was before all of this, but what we found is that, we talk about this, we positioned it as a tension between visibility and vulnerability, because what happened is influencers, unlike celebrities, are not seen as being, not seen as having the same level of sort of manufactured production. They're not, even if some of them do, they don't have agents. They don't have publicists. They're seemingly sharing their own voice. And so as part of this whole visibility mandate, influencers are expected to be out there to have an opinion on wider political and social issues. But at the same time, if they offer an opinion which strays at all from what audiences and or advertisers expect, they risk losing that. And more so than that, because of the networked nature of social media, they run the risk of widespread hate and harassment. And so this project that Emily and I did a few years ago, where we were interviewing Instagrammers, a lot of them felt this sort of pervasive fear to speak out on anything political because of not just their concerns about alienating audiences and advertisers, but more pointedly, the concern that they were going to open themselves up to hate and harassment. And another key element of this is the fact that when influencers partner with brands, a lot of times they have explicit rules about what they can or can't say. And so, in one hand, we call these people influencers, and, this is a term that sort of harkens back to public opinion leaders, because we expect them to have a voice on the social and political issues, again, that are sort of driving our society or driving it apart in certain cases. But at the same time, these are people who are ordinary people and don't have the same level of training. And often when they speak out on these issues, they open themselves up to public criticism and critical blowback. And so, I think, at the risk of being too sympathetic to the influencer community, I think that puts a lot on them when, they are expected to be sort of the leading political voices when, their training and craft comes from a very different domain. But it does remain to be seen, especially in the context, which I'm most familiar with, the US election, where all of a sudden, influencers were being paid to shill different political messages. And so I think we're at a really interesting historical juncture related to the transformation of influencers in our culture. Yeah, so thanks for that.
Right. I would like to know what are the theoretical differences among, say, influencers, content creators, and social media world?
Such a good question. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and trying to address it. And I don't know that I have a great answer. But I do think it is in some ways very platform dependent. And so I think this was written by Taylor Lorenz, who is the digital culture reporter for the New York Times. But she said that the term creators was actually something YouTube used, the platform used very strategically, rather than calling them entertainers or producers or any other term, or workers. And so, that's one way to think about creators. One of the reasons I prefer the term creators is I think, the term influencer is very much hitched to marketing, the idea of, you are influencing consumer purchases. And, it's a really interesting conversation among influencers themselves, because, the saying is, if you refer to yourself an influencer, you're not one. And so I like the term content creator, because what I think it really usefully does is showcases how the forms of activity they do and their orienting logics, which are drawing audiences and drawing advertisers, are part of a much longer story, which is what media workers have always done. And so, I think we can use the term creator to situate them on a longer trajectory of creative activities. And so, in response to the question about work, I think all of these are work. All of these are forms of work that sort of mask themselves as work that doesn't seem like work, which is in some ways why it's so problematic, because what we see on the screen is, you know, the 10-second TikTok clip, or, you know, the static image from Instagram, but we don't see the time and energy and work that went into both producing this image or narrative format, but also promoting it. And that's, you know, something that I've heard over and over again from content creators, is that, you know, they got into this field because, you know, they wanted to express a part of the creativity with the world. They wanted to share their creative self. They wanted to produce something. And so there's this idea of kind of the lone creative genius, but what they didn't expect is all the promotional work that it entails, from engaging with audiences to participating in these sort of reciprocal communities with other influencers or TikTok stars or YouTubers, to you know, reaching out to advertisers and trying to garner sponsorships and developing media kits. And so, you know, it's seen as quite glamorous and fun from the outside. Sorry, cat fight. But when you actually take a look at what is going on behind the scenes, I think it's a lot less glamorous.
Great. The next question from Ana Luisa Figueiredo. She asks, with the instability and changes in the algorithmic and platforms, what do you think is the message or the discourse from the platforms to the content creators?
Oh, I like that. What is the message or discourse from the platforms to the creators? I think in a lot of ways it's a power play. I mean, you know, we don't know exactly why an Instagram changes its algorithm, or TikTok changes its algorithm. And I mean, we can assume that there is an economic reason. And I think in a lot of cases, what happens is, you know, YouTube will come out or Instagram will come out and say, we're changing our algorithm in order to serve you better. Or another discourse is, we're banning certain types of content in order to protect the children. But what a lot of times these discourses of protect the children mean, or, you know, serve the user better, they're really an effort to satisfy the demands of advertisers. I mean, advertisers don't want to have their content associated with especially controversial forms of content creation. And controversial is, you know, probably needs to be put in scare quotes, because, you know, that's highly dependent on the platforms and the advertisers. But I think what the message is it renders creators beholden to platforms such that they really have no other choice or no other recourse. Because we can think of, you know, in a traditional media environment, if you are really frustrated with the magazine company or the newspaper company for which you work, you can take the skill set and go to another company. But the skills on any individual platform don't necessarily transfer. And more importantly, your capital, which is your audience currency, doesn't transfer either. And so, you know, I think essentially what this means is that platforms can, I don't want to say do anything they want, but I think they can make a lot of decisions that fundamentally impact creators, and creators don't really have a lot of recourse. They don't have a lot of opportunities to push back or challenge this. And this sort of lack of uncertainty is amplified by the fact that, you know, in contrast to traditional creative workers who could maybe organize on the shop floor, come together and find a way to pursue organized forms of resistance, it's a lot harder for these individual creators to find that. And so, yeah, I think the discourse is very much about the struggle and the contestation for power. And I'll just conclude my answer to this question by talking about an interview I had maybe 3 years ago. I think it was in the first wave of data collection with an Instagram content creator, and she was talking about the uncertainty and, you know, the fact that she may have to leave Instagram. And she said, but, you know, Instagram owns my content. And I don't think it hit me until that moment that, you know, we have however many content creators are driving the social media age, but they don't own their content. I mean, it's owned by the platforms. And so it really is a story of vast inequities where, you know, there's part of this sort of wider techlash. We're paying attention to platforms' exertion of power and how this impacts users. But I think we really need to pay more attention to how this impacts the creative community.
Great. Thanks. How do you understand, or what do you think about the new unions of content creators, like the Creator Union in the UK or YouTuber Union in Germany?
I think they are fantastic models. I often struggle to think about, you know, what would be, you know, when I critique the highly uneven nature of compensation, you know, what would a model be? And I know a few years ago there was this crowdsourced website called Who Pays Influencers, and it was a way for influencers to anonymously note how much they were receiving, because otherwise, you know, there was no way for a creator to know if they were getting $5 for a post, whereas a big creator was getting 5 million, whatever it may be. And so I think these unions offer a lot of potential. I think the challenge they run up against is, again, you know, the kind of tension I identified before between how competitive this is, and the platform inequality amplifies how competitive it is. And so I do worry, given how much power that, you know, YouTube and Instagram and others have, if there will be a way for them to systematically punish participants in that. So I think that's the challenge, is how do these unions maintain a large representative group of participants without any sort of fear of repercussions from the platforms themselves, because of the highly public nature of social media. I mean, you know, we're all compelled to brand ourselves. And so whereas previous unions had a much greater level of anonymity, I don't think it's possible to see the same levels of anonymity within the social media environment, which is a real challenge. But I mean, I'm thrilled to see these models.
One question from Isaf. She asks, would it be possible to talk about algorithmic modulation in the content of digital influencers? Did the interviewees talk about it? You talk about metrics, but I wanted to understand if you identified change related to content and formats more directly.
Interesting. Yeah, I find the topic of content moderation absolutely fascinating, because it's, again, one of these decision-making processes that completely shapes how we as users understand the world. But it's, you know, until recently, I don't think it was very well understood at all. And so in the past few years, we've seen some really useful research, as well as press accounts of content moderation. And I don't know if the creators thought as much about the wider systems of content moderation. It was more a sense of, I've been punished and I don't know why. One case that comes to mind was Ruby, who I mentioned, who said that she had been shadow banned multiple times. And she said one of the cases where she was cutting her hair, and I guess she got flagged as though that was the scissors was like a weapon. So there were sort of one-off cases, But I think more systematically, it was seen as just a flawed system. So, rather than saying, okay, well, I was systematically, or YouTube is systematically concealing content like mine because of X, Y, and Z, it was seen as YouTube or TikTok punished me, and it was a flaw in their system, and they shouldn't have. So, as I'm talking and thinking about your question, it's really interesting to think about the sort of dynamics between the sort of levels of content moderation that are linked to governance and what appeared in the interviews, which were these much more individualistic systems of unfairness. Yeah, really interesting.
Okay, thank you very much, Brooke. It's finished, and it was an amazing talk. And come here to Brazil next year or 2022 with Arturo Arriagada that is watching us tonight. In the name of our research labs, DigiLabour and culturais, we will thank you very much. Adriana?
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Brooke. It was great. And we hope to see you soon in another context,
yes.
Not so mediated, I guess. But thanks for this talk. And we're going to keep having this dialogue on these themes that are so interesting to us.
Thank you both. And thank you for the super thoughtful questions, which have given me a lot to ponder.
See you there. Thanks, bye-bye. Tchau, gente. Até a próxima live de DigiLabour com Cultpop.
Tchauzinho.